The blood wouldn't stop. It soaked through his uniform, dark and warm, turning the frozen ground beneath him into mud. Somewhere behind the trees, machine guns kept firing, sharp mechanical bursts that cut through the air like steel teeth. He lay flat, barely breathing, his helmet gone, his rifle several meters away. One leg burned with pain so intense it made his vision blur. He didn't know how long he had been there. Minutes, maybe hours. All he knew was this: his unit was gone. No voices. No footsteps, no shouted orders, just the wind, the distant artillery, and the slow, terrifying realization that he was completely alone. Wounded, bleeding, and trapped deep in enemy territory. Every instinct screamed at him to move, but moving meant death. The slightest sound could give him away. Enemy patrols were nearby. He had heard them earlier, speaking in low, unfamiliar tones. If they found him like this, there would be no mercy, no prisoner, just a single bullet, quick and final. He pressed his face into the dirt and tried to control his breathing. This was not how the war stories went. There was no heroic charge, no last stand with comrades at his side, just a broken body, a torn leg, and the crushing weight of fear pressing down on his chest. The cold crept into his fingers, his mouth was dry, his thoughts drifted dangerously close to surrender, not to the enemy, but to exhaustion. And yet, something inside him refused to let go. Not pride, not glory. Something more primitive, survival. He thought of home, of a face he had promised to return to, of a life that existed before uniforms and gunfire. And in that moment, bleeding into foreign soil, he made a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. If the war wanted him dead, it would have to work harder, because he wasn't done fighting yet. Before we continue, take a moment to imagine this. A single soldier, cut off from his unit, wounded, bleeding, surrounded by enemies who don't even know he's still alive yet. Stories like this are not just history, they are reminders of what the human mind and body can endure when survival is the only mission left. And this channel exists to tell those stories, the ones that don't always make it into textbooks, but were lived by real people in real war zones, where every decision meant life or death. If you're watching this, let us know in the comments which city and country you're watching from. These stories travel across borders, just like the men who were sent far from home to fight a war they didn't fully understand. And if you value deeply researched, immersive war narratives, stories of courage, fear, and impossible survival, make sure to subscribe to the channel. New true war stories are posted regularly, and each one is crafted to place you inside the moment, not just tell you about it. Now, let's go back to where this story truly begins. Not when he was bleeding on the ground, not when he realized he was alone, but hours earlier, when everything was still supposed to go according to plan. The mission was supposed to be simple: advance at dawn, secure the tree line, hold position until armor arrived. That was it. Nothing heroic, nothing complicated. Just another push through territory that had already been fought over, destroyed, and soaked with blood months before. He had learned not to trust the word simple in war. The night before the advance, the men barely slept. The ground was hard, the air damp, and the distant thunder of artillery never stopped long enough to let the silence feel safe. He lay on his back, staring into darkness, helmet resting on his chest, fingers tracing the worn fabric of his uniform. Around him, other soldiers breathed unevenly, muttered in their sleep, or stared quietly at nothing. No one talked about fear. You didn't need to. It was there, heavy and shared, like the cold. At first light, the order came. They moved out in staggered lines, boots sinking into wet soil, rifles held tight. The forest ahead looked harmless from a distance, thin trees, broken branches, patches of fog hanging low. But everyone knew better. Forests hid everything: snipers, mines, men who had been waiting for days without moving. As they crossed the open ground, the first shots cracked through the air, not wildfire, controlled, precise. The man to his left dropped instantly, as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. Someone shouted. Someone else fired back. The unit scattered for cover, diving behind trees, pressing themselves against earth that offered little protection. Training took over. He returned fire without thinking, aiming at flashes of movement he barely saw. The noise became overwhelming. Gunshots, shouts, the sharp metallic scream of bullets tearing through wood. Smoke crept through the trees. The smell of burned powder mixed with damp leaves and blood. Then the artillery hit. The first explosion knocked him flat. The second lifted him off the ground and slammed him against a tree so hard the air left his lungs. His ears rang. Dirt rained down. The world turned into noise and confusion. When he tried to stand, pain exploded through his leg. He fell again, screaming this time, clutching at his thigh. His fingers came away slick with blood. Shrapnel had torn through muscle and fabric, leaving a deep, ragged wound that burned with every heartbeat. Around him, the fight continued, but it was moving away. Orders were shouted, then drowned out by explosions. The unit began pulling back, forced by the sudden intensity of enemy fire. He tried to crawl after them, dragging himself forward inch by inch, but the pain was unbearable. His vision narrowed. His strength vanished faster than he could understand. Someone passed near him. He reached out, grabbing at a boot, trying to shout. The soldier never noticed. Within minutes, the sounds of battle shifted farther into the distance. The forest grew quieter, but not safe, never safe. He lay there, bleeding, his leg numb now, his mouth open as he gasped for air. He pressed his hand hard against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding the way he'd been taught. Every movement sent waves of nausea through him. Time lost meaning. The sky above the trees changed color. Shadows stretched. The air cooled. Flies gathered, drawn by blood. He waved them away weakly, his arm heavy as stone. At some point he understood the truth. They weren't coming back, not because they didn't care, but because war didn't allow room for the fallen. The advance had failed. The priority was survival, not rescue. A wounded man in enemy territory was a liability no one could afford. He was officially missing, unofficially dead. That realization was colder than the ground beneath him. As evening approached, new sounds crept through the forest. Boots, voices, not his language, enemy patrols. Panic surged through him like electricity. He forced himself to stay still, biting down on his lip to keep from crying out. His breathing slowed, shallow and controlled. Every instinct screamed to run, to fight, to do something. But he knew better. Movement meant discovery. He pressed his face into the dirt, eyes open, listening as footsteps passed uncomfortably close. A voice laughed. Another answered. A cigarette flared briefly in the dim light, then disappeared. They moved on. Only then did he allow himself to breathe again. Night fell fully, bringing cold that settled into his bones. His wet uniform stiffened, his fingers lost feeling. Thirst gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. He thought about calling out, about surrendering, about letting it end. But surrender here meant execution, and giving up meant something else entirely, letting the war decide for him. He clenched his jaw. If he was going to die, it wouldn't be quietly in the dirt. Not yet, not like this. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered again, shaking the earth. And in that moment, alone, bleeding and surrounded, he began to plan. Not how to fight, but how to survive. Survival began with stillness. He lay where he had fallen, barely moving, letting the darkness work in his favor. Every instinct told him to shift his position, to find cover, to do something, anything, but experience had taught him that movement drew attention. In enemy territory, silence was armor. His leg throbbed in slow, violent pulses. The pain was no longer sharp. It had become deep and nauseating, a reminder that blood loss was ongoing. He loosened his belt with trembling fingers and wrapped it high around his thigh, tightening it until his vision blurred. He welcomed the dizziness. It meant the bleeding was slowing. Cold settled in next. The forest exhaled a damp chill that crept into his bones. His wet uniform offered no protection. He forced himself to think clearly, to inventory what he still had. One pocket knife, a single remaining magazine for his rifle, somewhere out of reach. No food, no water, no medical supplies beyond what he could improvise. And a long night ahead. Sounds carried strangely in the dark. A snapped twig echoed like a gunshot. An owl's call made his heart race. Several times he heard voices again, enemy patrols moving in loose patterns, methodical and unhurried. They were searching. Not for him specifically, but for survivors, stragglers, anything left behind. He became part of the ground. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time blurred into pain and cold and waiting. At some point, the clouds thinned and moonlight filtered through the branches, illuminating the forest in pale silver. It was beautiful in a way that felt cruel. He knew he couldn't stay where he was. By morning, patrols would return, and daylight would expose him completely. If he wanted any chance at survival, he had to move, slowly, quietly, and before exhaustion claimed him. The first attempt nearly killed him. He dug his fingers into the soil and tried to pull himself forward. The motion sent white-hot agony through his leg, stealing his breath. He collapsed, face pressed into the dirt, teeth clenched to keep from screaming. Spots danced in his vision. He waited, breathed, tried again. This time he used his elbows, dragging his body inch by inch. The ground scraped his skin, branches tore at his uniform, blood soaked into the earth behind him, marking his path in a way that made his stomach twist with fear. He stopped often, listened, waited. Several times he froze completely as footsteps passed nearby. Once he heard metal clink, canteens maybe. A voice spoke sharply, close enough that he could make out the tone, even if not the words. He pressed himself flat, willing his body to disappear. The patrol moved on. By the time he reached a shallow depression between fallen trees, exhaustion crushed him. He rolled onto his back, chest heaving, staring up at the fragments of sky visible through the canopy. His mouth was so dry it hurt to swallow. Thirst was becoming a problem. He considered the risks and made a decision. When the forest fell silent again, he dragged himself a few more feet toward what he hoped was a low, muddy area. Using his helmet, he scraped together water from a shallow puddle formed by rain. It was brown and full of debris, but he drank it anyway, gagging as the cold liquid hit his empty stomach. It didn't matter. Dirty water was better than none. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped further. Shivering became uncontrollable, his body burning through precious energy. He pulled loose leaves and branches over himself, building a crude cover that trapped some warmth and broke up his outline. Alone in the dark, his thoughts turned dangerous. Doubt crept in. How far was friendly territory? Was anyone even looking for him? Would he bleed out before morning? His mind replayed the explosion over and over, each time ending the same way, with him alone and forgotten. He forced himself to focus on small goals, survive the night, avoid detection, move again at first light. At some point before dawn, sleep claimed him in short, shallow bursts. Each time he drifted off, he dreamed of home, of warmth, of safety, of a world without gunfire. Each time he woke, the cold and pain returned immediately. Grey light eventually filtered through the trees. Morning. With daylight came danger. He knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. Enemy patrols would spread out again, combing the area. His only hope was to move while visibility was still poor, using the fog that clung to the forest floor like a veil. He tightened the makeshift tourniquet one last time, ignoring the numbness spreading through his leg. Then, gritting his teeth, he began to crawl again, slowly, deliberately toward the east, guided by the rising sun and the faint hope that somewhere beyond the trees, the front lines still existed. Each movement was a gamble. Each sound could be his last. But as painful as it was, movement meant choice, and choice meant he was still alive. Behind him, the forest swallowed his trail. Ahead of him, survival waited, if he could endure what came next. By mid-morning, the fog thinned. Sunlight broke through the trees in narrow beams, cutting across the forest floor and stripping away the protection he had relied on since dawn. Every shadow felt exposed now, every movement risked being seen. He slowed his pace even more. His leg had gone frighteningly numb below the wound, but above it the pain had returned with a vengeance. Each time he pulled himself forward, fire raced up his spine. His hands shook constantly, not just from pain, but from exhaustion and dehydration. The muddy water from the night before had helped, but it hadn't been enough. Then he heard it, metal clanking, low voices, too close. He froze, heart hammering so hard he was sure it could be heard. He pressed his cheek into the dirt, eyes scanning through the undergrowth. Between two trees, less than 30 meters away, figures moved slowly, deliberately. Enemy soldiers, helmets low, rifles ready, sweeping the area in a loose line. They were searching now. One of them stopped, looked toward the ground, toward him. His breath caught in his throat. The soldier crouched, examining something on the forest floor. A dark stain. Blood. His blood. Time stretched into something unbearable. The man called out softly to the others. Boots shifted. The line tightened. This was it. He forced his breathing to slow, his body to remain still. Any movement would betray him. His fingers dug into the dirt as if anchoring himself to the earth. Sweat ran down his neck despite the cool air. The soldiers moved closer, 10 meters, 5. One of them lifted his rifle slightly, eyes narrowing as he studied the brush. Another stepped forward, pushing a branch aside. Then, unexpectedly, an explosion thundered in the distance. Artillery, heavy, close enough to shake the ground. The patrol reacted instantly. Shouts, gestures, orders barked sharply. Their attention snapped away from the forest floor, redirected toward the new threat. Within seconds, they were moving off at a quick pace, disappearing between the trees. He lay there, stunned, barely believing what had just happened. Chance had saved him, but chance would not keep doing that forever. As the sounds faded, his body betrayed him. His hands trembled violently, his chest heaved, tears welled up, hot and sudden, not from fear, but from the release of pressure that had been crushing him for hours. He wiped his face with a dirty sleeve and forced himself to move again. The forest began to change as he crawled deeper. The ground sloped gently downward. The trees thinned in places, revealing stretches of churned earth and broken branches, signs that heavy equipment had passed through at some point. That meant proximity to roads or supply routes. Both were dangerous, but also opportunities. Near noon, he found what he hadn't dared hope for, a discarded canteen. It lay half buried in mud, dented and scratched, its strap torn. He stared at it for a long moment, suspicious. Traps were common. He waited, listened. Nothing. With shaking hands, he pulled it free and twisted the cap. Water. He drank slowly at first, forcing himself not to gulp. The cold liquid slid down his throat like life itself. When the canteen was half empty, he stopped, capped it, and tied it awkwardly to his belt. For the first time since being wounded, something like optimism flickered. That feeling didn't last. As afternoon approached, the forest gave way to open ground. A shallow clearing stretched ahead, dotted with craters and wreckage. Crossing it would be suicide in daylight. He needed cover. Fast. He spotted a fallen log near the edge of the trees and dragged himself toward it, muscles screaming in protest. Just as he reached its shadow, he heard engines. Vehicles, low, steady, unmistakable. He peered through the brush. A convoy moved along a dirt road less than 100 meters away. Trucks. Troop carriers. Enemy markings clearly visible. Soldiers rode in the backs, relaxed but alert, rifles resting against their knees. So close he could see their faces. If he could reach that road at night, maybe he could follow it, away from the front, or toward chaos where lines blurred. Roads meant movement, movement meant direction. But daylight was still strong. He stayed hidden, conserving what little energy he had left. He drank a small amount of water, adjusted the leaves covering his body, listened. Pain faded into the background, replaced by a dull, dangerous numbness. He knew the signs: shock, infection, blood loss. His leg was swelling beneath the torn fabric, the skin hot to the touch. He couldn't delay much longer. As evening approached, the activity on the road slowed. The light softened. Shadows grew long again. He made his decision. At dusk, when the forest swallowed the last of the sun, he began crawling toward the road, each movement calculated, each breath controlled. The war rumbled around him, distant and indifferent. He wasn't thinking about victory anymore. He was thinking about distance. If he could put enough space between himself and this place, between himself and the men hunting him, then maybe, just maybe, refusing to die would be enough. The first thing he learned near the road was how loud silence could be. Every sound felt magnified. The scrape of his sleeve against dirt, the faint clink of metal at his belt, the shallow rhythm of his own breathing. The road lay just ahead now, a dark strip of packed earth cutting through the land like a scar. He stopped several times, listening, counting the seconds between distant engines and voices. Nothing moved. Slowly, painfully, he pulled himself closer until he could smell the road, oil, dust, something metallic. Tracks from tires and boots crisscrossed its surface. It was used often, too often. He waited. Minutes stretched, then an hour. His body ached in ways he didn't know were possible. His hands were swollen, fingers stiff. The wound in his leg throbbed, and a deep heat radiated outward, a warning he didn't want to acknowledge. Finally, he moved. He crossed the road in silence, dragging himself through the open as quickly as his body allowed. Every second felt exposed. When he reached the opposite ditch, he pressed himself into it and stayed there, unmoving, heart racing, waiting for the world to explode. It didn't. He allowed himself one shallow breath of relief. Using the ditch for cover, he began following the road, not on it but alongside it, keeping low, staying in shadow. Roads had direction. They led somewhere. He just needed to survive long enough to find out where. The night deepened. Clouds rolled in, hiding the moon and blessing him with darkness. Somewhere behind him, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. He crawled for what felt like hours, stopping only when pain forced him to. Several times vehicles passed, their engines vibrating through the ground. Each time he froze, blending into the earth. At some point, exhaustion overwhelmed him. He found a shallow culvert beneath the road, a narrow space where water once flowed. It was damp and cold, but hidden. He pulled himself inside, using broken branches to obscure the entrance. Inside the darkness, he shook uncontrollably. His body was failing. The wound had grown worse. His leg was swollen, stiff, and burning. The tourniquet had been tightened and loosened too many times. Infection was almost certain. He tore a strip from his undershirt and tried to clean the wound with what little water he had left. The pain nearly made him pass out. He bit down on the fabric, refusing to scream. Alone in the culvert, he confronted the possibility he had been avoiding. Even if he avoided the enemy, even if he stayed hidden, his body might still give out. He thought of surrender again, of crawling onto the road and letting it end quickly. The idea crept in softly, seductively, promising rest. He pushed it away. Rest meant death. At dawn, rain began to fall. At first, lightly, then harder. The road turned slick, the ditch filled with muddy water. He repositioned himself, keeping the wound elevated as best he could. Rain soaked through his clothes, but it also washed away his scent, blurred tracks, and softened sounds. Rain was a gift. When the worst of it passed, he emerged again, soaked and shaking, but alive. The road curved slightly now, descending toward lower ground. The land opened into rolling fields broken by hedgerows and scattered ruins. A village lay ahead, not intact. Nothing here was intact. Buildings stood hollowed out, walls blackened by fire. Roofs collapsed. A church spire leaned at an unnatural angle, scarred by shelling. Villages were dangerous, but they also meant shelter, supplies, water, maybe even abandoned medical equipment. As he approached, he stayed to the edges, moving through tall grass and debris. Smoke lingered in the air. The silence felt wrong, too complete. No animals, no voices. He found a house with its front wall blown away. Inside, debris covered the floor. Furniture lay splintered. He dragged himself inside and collapsed behind what remained of a staircase. There he drank the last of his water. He searched with shaking hands and found a cracked mirror. His reflection startled him. His face was pale, eyes sunken, beard matted with dirt and blood. He barely recognized himself. He rested there for hours, drifting in and out of consciousness. Voices woke him. This time, not enemy. They were softer, familiar. He didn't move, didn't breathe, listened. English, allied voices. He waited, terrified of being wrong. A boot scraped rubble. A shadow passed across the doorway. Someone coughed. Summoning everything he had left, he raised his hand weakly and knocked a piece of debris aside. "Help!" he croaked, his voice barely a sound. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a voice shouted, sharp and urgent, and footsteps rushed toward him. The footsteps stopped abruptly. For a fraction of a second, no one spoke. No one moved. He saw the shadow freeze at the doorway, the outline of a helmet shifting slightly as the person tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Then everything exploded into motion. "Medic!" someone shouted. Hands grabbed his shoulders, firm but careful. A rifle clattered to the floor. A flashlight beam cut through the dust-filled air and landed on his face, then dropped instantly to his leg. "Oh, hell! Look at that wound!" He tried to speak, to explain, but his throat closed. The adrenaline that had kept him alive for days finally collapsed, leaving him weak and dizzy. The ceiling spun. He felt himself being lifted, his body protesting every movement. "Easy, easy," a voice said, calm and controlled. "You're safe now. You're with us." Safe. The word barely made sense. A medic cut away his soaked trousers, exposing the damage. The smell of infection filled the room immediately, sweet, rotten, unmistakable. The medic swore under his breath. "How long?" he asked. The wounded soldier tried to answer. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Days," another voice said quietly. "Has to be." Morphine burned through his veins, and the pain dulled to something distant. Bandages tightened around his leg. Someone pressed a canteen to his lips, tilting it carefully. He drank, spilling more water than he swallowed. They carried him out into the grey daylight. Outside, the village looked different now, not abandoned, but alive with cautious movement. Allied troops had pushed back through the area overnight. The line had shifted again, just enough to reclaim what had been lost. Luck, timing, a fragile alignment of both. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, he caught fragments of conversation. He was behind enemy lines the whole time. Thought he was dead. Can't believe he made it this far. He wanted to tell them how close he'd come to giving up. How many times he'd almost surrendered to the dirt and the dark. But the words stayed trapped behind exhaustion. The ride out was a blur. The ambulance jolted over broken roads, each bump sending waves of pain through his body despite the drugs. He drifted in and out, waking to the sound of engines, to voices shouting directions, to the sting of rain on his face when the canvas flap shifted. At the field hospital, everything became noise and light. Doctors, orders, scissors cutting fabric, hands everywhere. He caught a glimpse of his leg again, angry red, swollen, streaked with black where tissue had begun to die. Infection, severe. They wheeled him into surgery without ceremony. He surfaced hours later in a different world. White sheets, the smell of antiseptic, the distant groan of other wounded men. His leg was heavy, wrapped, suspended slightly to reduce swelling. Pain pulsed beneath the morphine, but it was controlled. A doctor stood beside the bed, arms crossed. "You're lucky," the man said bluntly. "Another day out there and you wouldn't be here." He nodded weakly. They told him later what it had cost. The infection had been close to spreading beyond control. They'd had to remove damaged tissue aggressively. He would walk again, but not for a long time. The war, at least for him, was over. As days passed, reality settled in. He was listed as killed in action for nearly a week. A report had already been sent. Somewhere far away, someone had been told he wasn't coming home. That thought haunted him more than the pain. In the quiet hours of the ward, surrounded by groans and whispers, he replayed the moments that had kept him alive. Staying still, moving at night, drinking muddy water, refusing to surrender to fear. No single heroic act, just 1,000 small decisions not to quit. Other soldiers came by to look at him, curiosity and disbelief in their eyes. Some shook his hand gently. Others just stared. "You shouldn't be alive," one said softly. He knew. As weeks turned into months, he learned to walk again with a limp that would never fully leave him. He learned to sleep without waking at every sound. He learned that survival carried its own weight, that living meant remembering. When the war finally ended, he went home quieter than when he'd left. Thinner, changed, but alive. And whenever someone later asked him how he survived, how he endured being cut off, bleeding, hunted and alone, he never talked about courage. He talked about refusing to accept the moment the war tried to end him. Recovery was slower than the fighting had ever been. Weeks in the hospital blurred together, marked by the routine of pain, dressing changes, and the constant smell of antiseptic. The war continued beyond the walls, but for him it became something distant, almost unreal. He listened to reports from the front like stories from another life, battles advancing, lines shifting, men moving forward while he remained still. His leg healed in stages, never fully. Muscle had been lost, nerves damaged. Every step required effort and concentration. Physical therapy was brutal, stripping away any illusion that survival ended once the gunfire stopped. But the hardest wounds were not visible. At night, the forest returned. He woke drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced he could hear boots nearby. In his dreams, he was back in the dirt, face pressed into the ground, breath held as shadows moved closer. Sometimes he woke with his hands clenched, fingernails biting into his palms, as if still holding himself to the earth. No one talked about that part. They called it fatigue, shock, nerves. He accepted the explanations and learned to stay quiet. Other men in the ward did the same. They traded jokes during the day and stared at the ceiling at night, each trapped in his own memories. Eventually, orders came. He was being sent home. The decision felt strange. Part of him had expected to be pushed back into the fight, to finish what he'd started. Another part knew his war had ended the moment he'd been left bleeding in the forest. There was no returning from that. The journey home was long. Trains, waiting rooms, faces that looked at him with curiosity, then with respect once they noticed the limp, the uniform, the careful way he moved. He answered questions politely. Vaguely. He did not tell the story. Some stories felt too heavy to pass around. Home looked smaller than he remembered. The streets were quieter, the air smelled different. When he stepped inside his house, everything felt frozen in time, as if the world there had paused while he'd been gone. Photographs still hung on the walls. Furniture sat exactly where it had been before the war. People cried when they saw him. They hugged him like someone returned from the dead, because, in a way, he was. Official papers had already told a different story. His name had been mourned. His absence had been accepted. Living with that knowledge changed him. He carried a sense of borrowed time, of days he wasn't supposed to have. Ordinary moments, sunlight through a window, the sound of rain on a roof, the weight of a warm cup in his hands, felt sharper, more fragile. But peace did not come easily. Loud noises still made him flinch. Crowds felt suffocating. Silence sometimes was worse. He learned to choose seats with his back to walls. He scanned rooms without realizing it, always noting exits. Survival had rewired him. Years passed. The war faded into history books and ceremonies. Medals were given. Speeches were made. He attended some. He stood quietly at the back, uncomfortable with attention. When people spoke of heroism, of glorious sacrifice, he felt disconnected. He knew how thin the line really was. Occasionally, someone asked him to tell his story, to speak at a school, a local event, a gathering of veterans. He always hesitated, then sometimes he agreed. He never dramatized it. He described the fear, the hunger, the cold, the moments when giving up felt reasonable. He talked about crawling through dirt and drinking muddy water, about staying still while enemies passed within arm's reach. And he always said the same thing at the end. "I didn't survive because I was brave," he told them. "I survived because I refused to stop trying." That truth stayed with him. In old age, when his leg ached in the cold and his hands shook slightly, the memories softened but never disappeared. The forest remained a part of him, a place where everything had been stripped away except the will to live. When he finally passed many years later, he left behind no grand speeches, no epic declarations, just a simple record, a soldier, cut off, bleeding, left for dead, who refused to die. War is often remembered through maps, dates, and victories, but its true weight is carried in moments like this one, when a single life hangs in the balance, unseen, unnamed, and nearly erased. This soldier did not survive because of orders or strategy. He survived because, when everything was taken from him, his unit, his strength, his certainty, he made a choice, again and again, to stay still, to move when it mattered, to endure one more night, one more breath. Many did not get that chance. Behind every battlefield statistic is a story like this, lived in silence, written in blood and fear, and remembered long after the guns stopped firing. These are not stories of glory. They are stories of human limits, and of what lies just beyond them. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor those who faced the same darkness and never made it back. And if you want to hear more true war stories, stories of survival, loss, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because as long as these stories are told, those who endured will never truly be forgotten.